Generation Alpha is on track to be the most troubled generation of all time, and it's not even close. This is the era of mindless consumption, extreme polarization, and soulless, meaningless junk food entertainment. From the explosion of mental illness and violent crime to rampant consumerism and alarmism, our world is slowly degrading. And Gen A has been placed at the forefront of it all. Throw in a worldwide pandemic that shut down the entire globe for months, unhinged inflation, and technology that's becoming progressively more invasive, and you get a recipe that could destroy the minds and lives of millions. This is the generation of your little cousins, your younger siblings, or maybe even your kids. And while it may seem that these characteristics closely resemble those of Gen Z, there's one minor distinction that makes Gen A something that has never been seen in human history. Now, for those of you born anywhere between the 80s and the early 2000s, you might think of your life thus far in two main parts: life without the internet and life with the internet. You recall a time when phones were actually used for talking and when computers served as a tool rather than an alternate universe. You probably spent most of your free time outside or with other people. You were fully immersed in tangible reality, and your digital experiences were probably limited to a couple hours a day. Rather than scrolling through 300 different TikToks in an hour, you watched a couple episodes of your favorite show. When you were bored, you were forced to make use of your imagination or just sit there and enjoy the silence for a little while. Fast forward to 2023, and your life is probably completely different. You likely spend most of your time on a phone or computer, and while that might be problematic, it doesn't change the fact that your developmental years were spent without the presence of this invasive technology. And because of that, you have a firm comprehension of the contrast between the two eras, which allows you to quickly recognize the issues unique to modernity, even if you might fall victim to them sometimes. But what if you didn't have that point of reference? What if you were born in the last decade? What if you were thrust right into the most unstable and confusing era in human history? What would your basis for stability and normality be? This question encapsulates the one-of-a-kind situation faced by Generation Alpha, and no one seems to have an answer to it. In fact, no one has any clue how it's going to play out. And this isn't your typical case of generations pointing fingers at each other. This is an era that could see the most profound societal transformation in human history. It begins in the womb, where the development of the hypersensitive fetus is already being impacted by record levels of obesity and unnatural amounts of radiation from digital devices. Upon birth, the kid begins to observe the people around it constantly staring down at their phones, which they might come to think of as an instinctual human function for all we know. Upon reaching 6 months old, babies already have an understanding of the basics of a touchscreen, with a third of babies under the age of 1 displaying the ability to swipe. If you've been around a baby recently, you know that they are completely infatuated with smartphones. They tend to have far more interest in screens than any other toy. And this makes perfect sense considering the fact that the luminescent, interactive world of a phone screen is simply unlike anything else. The lights, sounds, and rapid movements are unbelievably stimulating to a baby's brain. By the age of 5 or 6, most kids already have their own iPads, which renders the rest of their toys completely useless. This is where they first encounter the confusing and detached world of the internet, where they will spend around 6 hours a day scrolling through mindless short-form content or watching other people play with toys. And if their parents didn't take the time to enable a child lock, it's likely they'll come across something that even adults find scarring. And you obviously can't expect a kid to be able to moderate themselves, which is why it's the parents' responsibility. But this can be much harder than it sounds. You see, having a smartphone has become standard for children as young as 7. Because of this, the entire culture of this generation is dictated by the internet. Everything they talk about or do for fun is sourced from the internet. So the one kid whose parents wouldn't buy them a phone is bound to be an outcast from the 2nd grade. Their ability to converse, socialize, and play is limited since they don't have access to the digital world that all the other kids are living in. And we know what excessive internet use does to adults, so we can only assume the impact would be much harsher on young children. But we also know how terrible social isolation can be, especially at a young age. So this leaves parents with a hard choice. Either they expose their 7-year-old to the brain rot of the internet, or they shield them from it and inhibit their ability to develop socially. Okay, fast forward to the current day, where the oldest of Gen A is about 13 years old. While many kids at this point will have had some level of developmental impairment, the real damage has yet to be done. Around this age is the time when many kids start to develop worldviews, opinions, and identities. They begin to comprehend some of the underlying dynamics of society and human nature, and naturally, their curiosity directs them towards the internet. And while the internet can be good for this, it has a far greater potential to ruin it. The internet is filled with useful information and resources, but it's completely smothered by masses of sensationalist garbage that's designed to hijack your emotions and get your click. And we adults fall for this all the time, so why wouldn't young children? The algorithm isn't going to serve them something educational or appropriate for their age. It's going to serve them a fresh batch of mind-numbing waste. It's going to serve them the same content that everyone else clicked on. And due to the nature of the internet, this is almost always something that's crafted to be as shocking and stimulating as possible. Or in other words, something that doesn't align with reality. And this works a lot like a drug. It's fast-paced, interesting, and gives you full control. As long as you keep swiping, it keeps delivering. It offers everything that reality lacks and more. And since Gen A has been exposed to this world from such a young age, its effects will have a much longer time to incubate, with most of that time being during some of the most important years of mental development. As a result, Gen A will likely see a much bigger spike in mental illness than Gen Z, and at a much younger age. Everything from depression to anxiety will be more rampant than ever. The less common disorder among Gen Z, known as internet psychosis, will likely become more widespread among Gen A. And everything only gets worse from here. You see, one of the coping mechanisms we have for the illness and emptiness caused by our modern habits is to double down and dive even deeper. And through this, many people actually find an outlet. Enter the toxic wastelands of Twitter and Reddit. Some of the people who need help the most come to these sites in search of an identity and fulfillment. In doing so, they come across a vast array of different political and cultural rabbit holes. Eventually, they find one appealing enough and allow it to completely take control of their identity and personality. And this is what has caused political and cultural discourse to become so diluted and polarizing. When a person's entire identity is completely reliant on certain ideas or beliefs, a simple questioning of those beliefs is an attack on them as a human being. And this problem will only be worse with Gen A down the line. Gen A doesn't know what the more tame political climate of the past looks like. They weren't around for the time when most people didn't really care or think about politics at all. By 2016, the oldest of Gen A was 6, and they got to witness the unprecedented 2016 election. Everything that has happened since 2016 is the only experience or knowledge they have about politics, which will heavily shape how they view it as they mature. And this will have massive implications down the line. Gen A will likely turn out to be even more radical and zealous than Gen Z, and the internet will be their main outlet of expressing it. And those who manage to avoid this trap won't have it much easier. As society becomes more divided and polarized, it becomes harder for those floating in between to find meaning and a sense of community. Because of this, Gen A will also be more nihilistic than Gen Z. And while this is terrible for us, not everyone loses here. Modern corporations stand to profit massively from this. If you take a generation suffering from mental illness, meaninglessness, and the inability to critically think, and you pair it with the fact that it's the largest generation in human history, you get something that corporate America could only dream of. Corporations have already taken note of this with Gen Z, using the masses of data they produce through their excessive social media use in order to make advertising more predatory and mind-reading. And this has worked fantastically for them. But in many ways, Gen Z is simply just a warm-up for Gen A. Since Gen A will spend even more time scrolling, they will produce even more data for corporations, which will then be used to make advertising even more effective. So as Gen A matures and enters the workforce, consumer spending and corporate profits will soar even higher. The mental instability paired with large swaths of data at corporations' disposal will make business easier than ever. As a result, the inflation-induced poverty we see today will only continue to get worse. Consumerism and materialism will be more prevalent than ever, but not in the traditional sense. You see, in the past, these things were exhibited through clothes, cars, houses, and jewelry. But that was back in the 2010s when people valued reality over the digital world. We're talking about 2035, when Gen A is in their 20s. While video game cosmetics and virtual reality existed before, they'll be the standard now. People will now pay for virtual clothes, virtual mansions, and virtual supercars as if they were real, and they will experience it all through a VR headset. And corporations will be happy to deliver, considering the fact that it's not real and costs nothing to produce. People will spend half their day working just to make enough money to sustain their physical bodies and virtual life. And as time goes on, the corporations behind this continue to gain more leverage over the people as they become more dependent on their product. The only thing that will remain unchanged is Western corporations' exploitation of third world labor to produce everything. And it's around this point that a hyper-reality will officially come into existence, alongside the beginning of the end of our species. Now, this is a problem that will take another decade to develop, but will require some serious intervention to prevent. And so far, no one is taking it all that seriously, with experts referring to the situation as an unintentional global experiment. We've seen how a lot of this plays out with Gen Z, and it's been nothing short of tragic. Gen Z has declined in almost every measure that matters, and the internet has made us painfully aware of it. To think that this cycle is going to repeat itself with another generation, and that no one is really standing up to it, shows you just how much everyone cares. The reality is that even though younger people are suffering from these problems the most, it's affecting people of all ages. And the entire situation is a catch-22. Our way of dealing with these problems is the same behavior that causes them in the first place. The only real way to end this vicious cycle would be to completely desert many of these modern technologies. But this option wouldn't be without problems either, as a large part of our economy is reliant on this technology. Many of the largest companies in the world are the producers of this technology, and they employ millions of us. So if they go under, so do we. The next 10 years could prove to be some of the most confusing and problematic years in human history. And while we can make a rough guess as to how things will play out, there's really no limit to what could happen.